Alright, this time around we're going to talk about if statements. It's one of several programming constructs. You may remember from one of the earlier videos I made the statement that Python typically starts at the first line of the file and just moves down and sequentially runs each line of code, but there were a few ways to change the program flow and to keep it from doing that, having some control on what code is actually executing and what's not. If statements is one of those ways. Um, Basically, an if statement, it works like this. You have some kind of comparison or some kind of either a comparison or some kind of other way of checking for a true or false condition. And if that whatever you're checking is true, then you'll run code inside of the if statement. If it's not true, if it's false, you'll ignore that code and skip it. As you can see, that can be useful because you might want to have some kind of reactive program that only does like a certain thing under a certain situation, and if statement's one of the ways that can ensure that will happen. Basically, here's the syntax for an if statement. You'll say if something. We'll say if 3 is less than 5, which is true. Then you'll have your comparison or comparisons. Like you could do logical operators also. You could say if 3 is less than 5 and 3 is less than 4, and this is true and that's both true. So since both sides are true, the and would let a true be returned. And you can chain a bunch of these statements together if you wanted to. And then you're going to always end the if statement with a colon like so, which is kind of part of the syntax. And then on the next line or lines, you can do more than one thing that happens inside of an if statement. You could do something like print, yes, or whatever you want to do. Now you'll notice that this line here is indented. This plain text editor that I'm using actually recognizes Python syntax, so it indented for me automatically. But anything that you want to be ran inside the if statement will need to actually be indented one level deeper than what the if statement is. That has to do with a thing called scoping, which I'll discuss a little bit more in a few minutes. But we'll go ahead and run this real quick. And actually I need to save it first, and then we'll run it. And you'll see, well, I forgot that I had this set up. The enter a number, we'll deal with that in a second. But it just says yes, because these are both true, and with an if statement, anything, if the condition in this part of the if statement winds up being true, it runs any code that's associated with it. So if I change this to 5 less than 4, then this right hand side would be false. Going back to the conditional operators in the previous video. Since this side's false, then this will return a false overall because the and requires both sides to be true. So you'll see in that case that yes is not ran, or it's not printed to the screen because it's false. So since it's false, it won't run. Now let's make this a little bit more not complicated, a little more useful than just putting hard-coded stuff in that's always true or always false. Let's say we ask the user to enter a number like we did up here, and then we convert that value they entered to an integer, because as I discussed in the previous video, everything that you get from the user via raw input will always be a string. So if you expect it to be to use it like a number, then you have to convert it. So let's say if user number says less than 10, print less than 10. And then you'll see here that we can control the program flow that way. Say they enter 5, that's less than 10, so we print less than 10. But then say you enter 20, well 20 is not less than 10, so this is not printed. Now you can actually add a default case. It's called else. And with else, you just type the keyword else followed by a colon, and then on the next line you dent over, you can do whatever you want. So I'll just put not less than 10. And this kind of adds a default case to your code. Basically, if you have an if statement and it's not true, then it'll just, if this isn't true, if the if statement's not true, it'll run the else. If the if statement is true, it'll run what's inside the if and ignore the else. So we run this again, you can say 5, it'll say that's less than 10. If we do 10, you'll say that's not less than 10, which is what we expect because this was false, so it ran the else statement instead. Now finally, what if you have multiple things you want to check? What if say, you know, we want to actually print out what number it is. Like say if we just had a program where we wanted to use the if statement to print what number was asked, was entered, what number was entered. Jeez. Then you could use a thing called else if, and it's an if else. Right here is the if else chain because you have an if and else. You can have an if else if chain, and you can use the keyword elif, which stands for else if. The else ifs will also have a condition just like user number, just like the if statement does. So you could say user number, say we'll just say equals 9, then your colon, and then what you want to do, and we'll say is 9. Okay? And you can repeat that several times if you want to. You could say elif, user number equals 8. Then print is 8, and we'll change this to less than or equal to. That way I can say no, just change not less than or equal to. Just change this to equals to. Then we can say is 10, and this else, the last thing we check for is an 8, so we can say we'll say less than 8. Let's see the sucker in action. Okay, we'll run it a few times. Go ahead and clear the screen. Let's say we enter 10. It's going to say is 10. We enter 9. It shows it is 9. Enter 8. It is 8. Enter 7 or 6 or 5 or whatever, and it'll say less than 8. Now the way these if else chains work is it's going to check the if statement. If this winds up being true, it runs any code associated with it via the indent, and then it skips the rest of this stuff. So in the case of this being true, and then this part, if this is true, it prints is 10. All this stuff here just gets ignored, completely skipped. If this winds up being false, then it skips all this stuff, checks this one. If it's true, it runs that, skips the rest. If this is false, it moves to the next one. Yeah, same idea. And then eventually if all these fail, it gets to the else statement, and then whatever's in the else statement just runs. You could also do it this way. You're not required to have the else if you don't wish to. There'll be situations where you wouldn't want the default else. So in that case, if we entered 5, nothing happens because it checked this, it was false, so it skipped it. This one was false, so it didn't do that. This one was false, it didn't do that. But then once again, if I did 10, then user number equals 10 is true, so it would print this, and then it would just totally ignore this stuff. There's no point in checking it because this part was true. That's the basics on the if statement, the elif, and the else.